Be the mother to my sons," the mountain man told the widow who had lost everything. But the moment she stumbled into that frozen canyon, nothing about her life or his would ever be the same again. A lonely widow, chased off her land with nothing but a quilt on her back. A wounded mountain man bleeding into the snow. And two terrified boys hiding behind him as thunder rolls over the ridge. She wants only to survive the winter, but he gives her a plea that stops her cold. Be the mother to my sons. As church bells echo across the valley, hooves thunder closer. A dark secret rises from his blood-soaked pack, a secret tied to stolen water, a murdered woman, and a bounty posted on 3 innocent children. Now the widow must choose, walk away into the storm, or stand between these boys and the men who already destroyed her life. What happens when a woman with nothing left to lose becomes the only shield a family has left? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Isabel Boone pulled her worn shawl tighter as she stepped out of her small farmhouse into the biting winter morning. The sun had barely risen over the Colorado foothills, casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as she made her way to the barn, her boots crunching on the frozen grass. The barn door creaked as she pushed it open, and the familiar smell of hay and livestock greeted her. Inside, her remaining animals stirred. 2 milk cows, her faithful mare Penny, and a handful of chickens. It wasn't much, but it was all she had left after 3 years of drought and struggling to keep the farm going since Thomas's passing. "Morning, girls," she said softly, reaching out to pat one of the cow's flanks. The animal's warmth was welcome against her cold fingers. Isabel worked methodically, moving through her morning chores with practiced efficiency. Each motion was familiar, feeding, milking, checking water troughs, yet tinged with worry about the meeting that lay ahead. As she worked, she whispered prayers under her breath, something she'd done more and more lately. "Lord, please let Mr. Corman show mercy today. Just a little more time is all I need." She'd been saying those same words for weeks now, hoping each time they might finally be answered. The morning wore on, and Isabel's anxiety grew with each passing hour. By noon, her stomach was in knots as she heard the approaching sound of hoofbeats. Through the barn door, she watched Miles Corman ride up with 3 of his men, their horses' hooves kicking up dust despite the cold. Corman sat tall in his saddle, his black coat crisp, and his hat pulled low over his eyes. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man used to having his way, while his men spread out behind him like a pack of wolves surrounding their prey. "Mrs. Boone," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "I trust you have my payment ready?" Isabel stepped out of the barn, wiping her hands on her apron. She lifted her chin, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Mr. Corman, if I could just have 1 more week." "I've heard that song before," he cut her off, his tone sharp as a knife. 3 months of extensions is more than generous. I'm a businessman, not a charity. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Your loan is forfeit. This property and all assets now belong to me." Isabel's heart pounded against her ribs. "Please, Mr. Corman. This land was Thomas's life, our life. Surely we can work something out?" "The time for working things out is long past." He nodded to his men, who began moving toward the barn. "Boys, start with the livestock. Everything goes." "No!" Isabel stepped forward, but one of Corman's men blocked her path. She watched helplessly as they led out her animals one by one. The cows she'd hand-raised from calves, the chickens that had supplied her with eggs through lean times, and finally Penny, her sweet-tempered mare, who'd been her constant companion since Thomas's death. "You can't take everything," she protested, her voice breaking. "How am I supposed to start over?" Corman's face remained impassive. "That's not my concern, Mrs. Boone. You have until nightfall to gather your personal belongings and clear out. Anything left behind becomes mine." With that, he turned and began supervising his men as they inventoried her farm equipment and tools. Isabel stood rooted to the spot, watching as her world was dismantled piece by piece. The sound of her animals being led away seemed to echo in her ears like a funeral dirge. Finally, forcing herself to move, she went inside the small farmhouse. Her hands trembled as she looked around the home she and Thomas had built together. There wasn't much she could carry, and she knew she had to choose carefully. She pulled out her mother's old carpet bag from under the bed and began to pack. Her fingers brushed against Thomas's family Bible, and she carefully wrapped it in a clean cloth before placing it in the bag. Next came her grandmother's quilt, folded as small as she could make it. She added her small hunting knife, wrapped in leather, and a metal flask she filled with fresh water from the pump. As she moved through the house, memories ambushed her at every turn. The wooden spoon Thomas had carved for her their first Christmas together. The chair where she'd sat countless evenings, mending clothes by lamplight. The window where she'd watched thunderstorms roll in across the plains. Each item she had to leave behind felt like another small death. When she'd finished packing her meager belongings, Isabel changed into her sturdiest dress and boots. She put on every layer she owned, her warmest petticoat, wool stockings, her heavy shawl. The temperature was dropping as afternoon waned, and she knew she needed whatever protection she could get. Outside, Corman's men had finished their work. They'd taken everything of value, leaving only empty buildings behind. Corman himself sat on his horse, watching as Isabel emerged from the house. "Remember, Mrs. Boone," he called out, "anything left at sundown is mine by right." He turned his horse, leading his men and her confiscated livestock away. The sound of their departure faded slowly, leaving Isabel alone in the gathering cold. She stood for a long moment, staring at the only home she'd known for the past 8 years. The wind had picked up, carrying the first few snowflakes of the storm that had been threatening all day. She knew she couldn't stay. Corman would send men back to check, and she had no doubt they'd force her out if necessary. With her carpetbag in hand and fighting back tears, Isabel turned toward the high country. She'd heard there were settlements up in the foothills, though she'd never visited them herself. It was her only option now. She couldn't go back to the town where Corman held sway over everything and everyone. The first mile was the hardest, each step taking her further from everything familiar. The snow began falling more steadily, adding to her difficulty. The bag grew heavy in her hands, and her arms ached from carrying it, but she pressed on, one foot in front of the other. As dusk approached, the temperature plummeted further. The snow was falling thick enough now to obscure the path ahead, and Isabel's steps became increasingly uncertain. Her boots, though sturdy, weren't made for this kind of journey, and her feet were growing numb despite her wool stockings. The shadows lengthened and deepened around her as night settled in. Every tree looked the same in the gathering darkness, and Isabel realized with growing fear that she had no idea how far she'd come, or exactly where she was headed. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and her fingers were so cold she could barely grip her bag. "Please, Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Show me the way, give me strength, send me some sign of shelter, some hope of survival." She stumbled on a hidden root, catching herself against a tree trunk. The rough bark bit into her frozen hands, but she barely felt it. The snow swirled around her in the darkness, and the wind cut through her layers of clothing like a knife. Isabel knew she needed to find shelter soon. The stories of people frozen in winter storms were all too common in these parts. But in every direction she saw only trees and shadows, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. She forced herself to keep moving, though each step was harder than the last. Her prayer became a constant whisper on her lips as she pushed forward through the deepening snow. The cold had settled into her bones, making her movements slower and clumsier. She was shivering uncontrollably now, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words of her prayers. The night had fully claimed the landscape, turning the world into a maze of dark shapes and whirling snow. Isabel's exhaustion had become so complete that she could barely tell if she was still walking in a straight line. Each breath was a struggle against the cold air that seemed to freeze in her lungs. She stumbled again, this time falling to her knees in the snow. The cold bit through her skirts immediately, but she found it harder and harder to summon the strength to stand. Her carpet bag slipped from her numb fingers, and she had to feel blindly in the darkness to find it again. "Help me," she whispered into the night, her voice trembling. "Please, someone help me." But only the wind answered, howling through the trees like a wild thing. Isabel huddled there in the snow, shivering and exhausted, praying for any sign of shelter or life as the winter night closed in around her. Dawn crept over the mountains with hesitant fingers of pale light. Isabel stirred beneath the pine bough that had offered meager shelter through the endless night. Every muscle ached from shivering, and her clothes were stiff with frost. She hadn't truly slept, merely dozed in fits and starts, jerking awake whenever the wind howled or branches cracked under the weight of snow. Rising carefully, she brushed ice crystals from her skirts and retrieved her carpet bag. The morning light revealed a dusting of snow across the landscape, just enough to soften the edges of rocks and fallen logs. Her breath clouded in the crisp air as she got her bearings. That's when she spotted it, a narrow trail winding through the undergrowth. It wasn't much more than a game path, really, but it sparked a memory. Years ago, Thomas had mentioned an old trapper's cabin up in these hills. He'd taken shelter there once during a spring storm. If she could find it. Isabel adjusted her shawl and started up the trail. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and her stomach cramped with hunger, but she forced herself to keep moving. The path wound steadily upward, following the contours of a steep ravine. Pine needles crunched under her boots, and somewhere overhead a jay called harshly. The sun had climbed higher, warming her slightly when she heard it. A low groan, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the trees. Isabel froze, listening intently. There it was again, coming from somewhere ahead and to her left. "Hello?" she called softly, setting her bag down. "Is someone there?" No answer came, but she thought she heard movement. Cautiously, Isabel left the trail, picking her way between frost-rimed boulders. The ground was treacherous with loose stones hidden under patches of snow. She rounded a massive boulder and stopped short. A man lay crumpled against the rock face, his buckskin jacket dark with blood. Beside him huddled two boys, one about 12 years old, the other perhaps 8. The younger child clung to his brother, his face buried against the older boy's shoulder. "Please," the older boy said, his voice cracking. "Can you help our pa?" Isabel moved forward slowly, keeping her movements gentle and open. "I'm Isabel Boone," she said softly. "I have some knowledge of healing. Will you let me look at your father's wound?" The older boy studied her face intently, then nodded. "I'm Anthony Redden. This here's my brother Jonas, and that's our pa, Hawk Redden." Isabel knelt beside the injured man. His face was drawn with pain, but his eyes were alert and wary as they tracked her movements. A quick assessment showed the source of bleeding, a bullet wound in his right thigh. "Mr. Redden," she said quietly, "I need to clean and bind that wound. I learned some healing ways from my husband's grandmother. She was Cherokee. Will you trust me to help?" Hawk's voice was rough but steady. "Ain't got much choice, ma'am. Been trying to keep moving since before dawn, but the leg won't hold me anymore." Isabel hurried back to her carpet bag, returning with her grandmother's quilt. She tore several strips from its edge, her heart aching at the necessity. The rest she spread over Hawk's legs, trying to warm him. "Anthony," she said, "I need you to gather some pine needles, the fresh green ones, and any wintergreen you can find. Jonas can help you look." She showed them what to search for, and the boys moved off, though Jonas kept glancing back anxiously. While they gathered supplies, Isabel examined the wound more closely. "The bullet went clean through," she said. "That's good. Means we don't have to dig it out. But it needs cleaning and proper binding to stop the bleeding." Hawk nodded grimly. "Reckon I'm lucky. Fellow who shot me was aiming for my chest. Would have hit it too if I hadn't slipped on those wet rocks." "Who shot you?" Isabel asked, using snow to clean around the wound as gently as possible. "Man named Corman and his bunch. Been trying to drive us off our land up by Crystal Springs. Claims he has paper rights to it, but we were there first. Built proper claim markers and everything." Isabel's hands stilled for a moment. "Miles Corman? You know him?" "He took my farm yesterday. Everything I owned, except what I could carry in this bag." A look of understanding passed between them. Before either could speak further, the boys returned with handfuls of pine needles and wintergreen leaves. Isabel showed them how to chew the pine needles into a poultice, explaining how it would help fight infection. She crushed the wintergreen leaves, releasing their strong scent, and pressed them around the wound for their numbing properties. Throughout her ministrations, Jonas watched with serious eyes, though he hadn't spoken a word. "Jonas hasn't talked since—" Anthony hesitated, glancing at his father. "Since our ma died. 3 weeks ago now. Same night we had to run from our cabin." Isabel's heart ached for the silent child. She smiled gently at him as she worked, explaining each step of the healing process in a soft, steady voice. Though Jonas didn't speak, he moved closer, watching intently as she bound the wound with strips of quilt. "There," she said finally, sitting back on her heels. "That should hold for now, but you'll need proper tending when we can find shelter." She looked up at the sky, where dark clouds were gathering ominously. "And we'll need to find it soon. There's more snow coming." Hawk pushed himself up straighter against the boulder, testing the bandage. "Thank you, Mrs. Boone. We're much obliged. But you don't need to stay with us. We've already caused you enough trouble." Isabel shook her head firmly. "Mr. Redden, none of us can survive out here alone, especially not with a storm coming and Corman's men about. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I've just used up half my quilt binding your leg. I'm invested now." A ghost of a smile touched Hawk's weathered face. "Reckon you've got a point there, ma'am." Anthony had been watching the sky, too, his young face serious. "Pa, those clouds look bad, like the ones that brought the big snow last winter." Isabel gathered her remaining supplies, tucking them back into her carpet bag. "We need to move soon, but first you should rest a bit, Mr. Redden. Let the wintergreen do its work. I'll keep watch." She settled nearby, where she could see both the trail and the ravine below. Jonas surprised her by sitting close to her side, though he still didn't speak. After a moment's hesitation, she put an arm around his thin shoulders. He stiffened briefly, then gradually relaxed against her. The wind was picking up, carrying the sharp scent of approaching snow. Isabel watched the clouds gathering over the peaks, trying not to let her worry show on her face. They couldn't stay here much longer, but she wasn't sure Hawk could walk far on that injured leg. Anthony sat down on his father's other side, his posture mirroring Hawk's watchful alertness. Despite his youth, there was something old in his eyes, the look of a child who had grown up too fast. Isabel recognized it. She'd seen it in her own reflection after Thomas died. Time crept by as they waited, the wind growing steadily stronger. Hawk dozed fitfully, his face lined with pain even in rest. Jonas remained pressed against Isabel's side, occasionally reaching out to touch the torn edge of her quilt, where it covered his father's legs. Finally, Hawk stirred, blinking away his brief sleep. "Storm's almost here," he said grimly. "We need to move." Isabel helped him stand, trying not to show her concern at how heavily he leaned on her. Anthony quickly moved to support his father's other side, while Jonas gathered up Isabel's carpet bag without being asked. The first snowflakes began to fall as they stood there, 4 strangers bound together by circumstance and necessity. None of them spoke aloud what they all knew. They couldn't remain in the open, but their options for shelter were few, and Hawk's injury made every step a challenge. Dark clouds rolled closer overhead, and the wind cut through Isabel's shawl like a knife. She tightened her grip on Hawk's arm, feeling the strength in him despite his injury. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Evening shadows crept through the ravine like dark water, bringing with them a biting mountain chill. Isabel added another handful of small branches to their meager fire, trying to coax more warmth from the flames. The wood was damp from snow, and smoke curled upward in thin wisps that disappeared into the growing darkness. Hawk Redden stirred against the boulder where they'd propped him, his eyes fluttering open. Fever had settled in despite Isabel's herbs, and his skin felt hot beneath her palm when she checked his brow. He grabbed her wrist suddenly, his grip weak but urgent. "They might come back," he rasped, eyes focusing on her face with effort. "Corman's men. They're still out there hunting us." "Hush now," Isabel soothed, gently loosening his grip. "Save your strength. We've seen no sign of anyone following." Anthony moved closer to the fire, his young face grave in the flickering light. "Pa's right, though. They've been tracking us since—" His voice caught, and he swallowed hard before continuing. "Since they killed our ma, 3 weeks ago now." Isabel's heart clenched at the pain in the boy's voice. She looked at Jonas, who sat silent beside his brother, staring into the flames. The younger boy hadn't spoken a word since she'd found them. "Jonas hasn't talked since that night," Anthony explained quietly, wrapping an arm around his little brother's shoulders. "Not one word. He saw—" The older boy stopped, unable to continue. Jonas pressed closer to his brother, his small fingers clutching Anthony's worn jacket. Isabel wanted desperately to comfort them both, but held back, unsure if her touch would be welcome. Hawk's eyes had drifted to Isabel's belongings, narrowing as they fixed on her carpet bag. "That saddlebag," he said hoarsely. "Where'd you get it?" "It was mine," Isabel replied, touching the worn leather. "Corman's men took it yesterday when they seized my farm. I found it abandoned on the trail this morning, probably dropped in their haste." Hawk struggled to sit up straighter, grimacing with the effort. "Saw his brand on it. MC connected. Same man who's trying to steal our spring claim. Same one who—" His voice hardened. "Same one who sent men to drive us out. Who killed Sarah." The pieces fell into place in Isabel's mind. Their shared enemy, their parallel losses. No wonder the boys looked at her with such wariness. They'd already seen one woman die at Corman's hands. "Be the mother to my sons," Hawk said suddenly, his voice rough but clear. "Until I can stand again." Isabel stared at him, startled by the blunt request. Mr. Redden, I can't. I'm no replacement for their mother. I can stay tonight, help tend your wound, but come morning. Please, Anthony interrupted, his voice smaller than it had been all day. We don't know how to help Pa proper. And Jonas. He glanced at his silent brother. Jonas needs someone gentle, like you were today, with the healing. I'm sorry, Isabel said firmly, though her heart ached at the plea in Anthony's eyes. I'm not what you need. I couldn't even keep my own farm. I have nothing to offer. A long howl echoed through the darkness, followed by another, closer. Wolves, moving through the night. Jonas pressed against Isabel's side before she could move away, his small body trembling. Anthony shifted closer, too, though he tried to hide his fear. Isabel found herself wrapping an arm around Jonas, murmuring soft reassurance. It's all right, little one. They won't come near the fire. The boy's shivers gradually eased, though he didn't pull away. She fed more branches into the flames, watching sparks spiral upward into the darkness. The fire was their only defense against both cold and predators, and she couldn't let it die. The night stretched long ahead, full of dangers she couldn't fight alone. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped further. Snow began falling more heavily, the flakes large and wet. Isabel had wrapped her remaining quilt around the boys, who now slept fitfully beside the fire. Jonas still hadn't moved from her side. Mrs. Boone. Hawk's voice was barely above a whisper. She turned to find him watching her, his eyes clearer than they'd been earlier. I know it's too much to ask, but I'm asking anyway. Not for me. For them. Isabel looked down at Jonas's sleeping face, peaceful for the first time since she'd met him. At Anthony, trying to be so brave even in sleep, one hand still gripping his brother's sleeve. At Hawk, wounded and desperate to protect his sons. The wind picked up, driving snow into their shallow shelter. Another wolf howled, closer than before. Isabel thought of the long night ahead, of all the nights she'd spent alone since Thomas died, of how it felt to have nothing left to give, and yet somehow finding more to give anyway. Until morning, she said finally. I'll stay until morning at least. After that, she sighed. After that, we'll see. Hawk's relief was visible even in the dim firelight. Thank you, he said simply. Isabel settled back against the rocky wall, Jonas warm against her side, Anthony just beyond him. The fire crackled softly, pushing back the darkness. Snow continued falling, slowly blanketing the world outside their small circle of warmth. They were four strangers bound together by loss and necessity, huddled in a shallow ravine beneath a growing storm. Isabel watched the flames dance and wondered what morning would bring. For now, though, she had promises to keep, to tend the fire, watch over the boys, and see them all through until dawn. The wind howled through the pines, carrying the wolves' song. Jonas stirred in his sleep, and Isabel instinctively tightened her arm around him. Hush now, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was comforting the boy or herself. Hush now. We'll be all right. In the darkness beyond the firelight, snow continued falling, covering their tracks, erasing the path that had led them here. Tomorrow would bring its own decisions, its own challenges. But for now, they had fire and shelter and each other. For now, that would have to be enough. The night deepened around them, and Isabel kept her vigil, watching over her unlikely charges as the storm gathered strength. Every so often, she would catch Hawk's eyes across the fire, watchful, grateful, worried. They shared the silence, broken only by the crack of burning wood and the soft breathing of sleeping children. Jonas shifted closer in his sleep, his small hand finding hers in the darkness. Isabel found herself humming softly, an old lullaby her mother had sung, its gentle melody mixing with the wind's whisper through the pines. The boy's face relaxed further, some of the fear smoothing from his features. The fire needed constant tending to keep it alive against the wet snow and wind. Isabel moved carefully each time she added wood, trying not to disturb the boys. Their warmth against her side was both comfort and responsibility, a reminder of how quickly life could change, how easily fate could bind strangers together in the wilderness. Thunder rolled in the distance, a low growl that echoed through the ravine. The storm was growing stronger, as if nature itself was conspiring to keep them together through the long night ahead. Isabel pulled the quilt tighter around the boys and settled in to wait for dawn. Morning arrived with a thick blanket of snow. The flakes fell steadily, transforming the ravine into a world of white. Isabel shivered awake, stiff from sitting upright against the rocky wall all night. Jonas still slept against her side, his small face peaceful despite the cold. Hawk tried to stand but stumbled, his wounded leg buckling beneath him. The fever hadn't broken, and his skin felt hot to Isabel's touch when she checked his bandage. "There's a line cabin," he said through gritted teeth. "Maybe half a day's walk north. Old trapper I knew used it years back." He gestured vaguely toward the distant ridgeline. "Might still be standing." Isabel nodded, knowing they couldn't stay exposed to the elements much longer. "Anthony," she called softly to the boy who was already awake and watching. "Help me gather some strong branches. We'll need to make a travois." Anthony proved quick to understand and eager to help. Together they collected fallen pine boughs, and Isabel showed him how to lash them together using strips torn from her petticoat. She'd seen such sleds made before, during her years on the frontier, though she'd never had to build one herself. "Like this?" Anthony asked, testing the strength of their knots. His serious expression reminded her so much of his father's. "That's right," Isabel encouraged. "Now help me secure these cross pieces." They worked together, their breath frosting in the cold air, until they had fashioned a crude but sturdy travois. Getting Hawk onto the makeshift sled proved challenging. He was a large man, and though he tried to help, the pain left him weak. Finally, they managed to settle him, using Isabel's quilt as padding beneath him. "Jonas," Isabel called gently to the younger boy, who hovered nearby. "Would you carry your pa's pack? It's important work." The child nodded, shouldering the small leather bag with solemn dedication. They set out slowly through the deepening snow. Isabel took the first turn pulling the travois, with Anthony walking ahead to pick the easiest path. The going was difficult. The snow made everything slippery, and the travois caught occasionally on hidden rocks or branches. After an hour, Anthony insisted on taking his turn pulling. "I'm strong enough," he said firmly. "Pa taught me to do my share." Isabel watched his determined stance and nodded, helping him adjust the leather straps across his chest. Around midday, they came upon a narrow stream, its edges rimed with ice but its center still flowing. Isabel knelt beside it, breaking through the thin crust to refill her flask. "Drink," she urged the boys, showing them how to cup their hands to catch the crystal-clear water. While they rested briefly, Isabel studied her unlikely companions. Anthony maintained his watchful guard, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, shoulders tense with responsibility. Jonas stayed close to his brother, communicating through small gestures, a tug on Anthony's sleeve when he was tired, a pointed finger when he spotted a deer track in the snow. "You're doing well," Isabel told them both, keeping her voice gentle. "Your pa would be proud of how you're helping." Jonas gave her the ghost of a smile, the first she'd seen from him. They continued their slow journey through the afternoon. The snow never ceased, though it lightened somewhat. Isabel and Anthony took turns pulling the travois, developing a rhythm of switching places every hour or so. Hawk drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling directions or warnings about the terrain. Just before dusk, when Isabel's arms ached and even Anthony's steady pace had begun to flag, they crested a small rise and saw the cabin. It was little more than a shack, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a sagging metal roof, and a crooked chimney. But it was shelter. "Thank the Lord," Isabel breathed, then called back to the boys. "Look, we've made it." The cabin's door creaked open at her touch, revealing a single room with a dirt floor. A broken three-legged stool lay on its side, and a rusted stove squatted in one corner. Cobwebs draped the single window, but the roof appeared sound, and the walls would block the wind. Getting Hawk inside took all their remaining strength. They managed to slide him from the travois onto a relatively flat spot near the stove. Isabel immediately set about checking his wound, while Anthony and Jonas gathered what dry wood they could find. "The bullet needs to come out," Hawk said weakly, his face sheened with sweat despite the cold. Isabel pressed her lips together, knowing he was right but dreading the task. "Tomorrow," she said firmly, "when there's better light. For now, rest." The boys got a fire going in the rusted stove, and warmth slowly began to fill the cabin. Isabel retrieved the small pouch of dried apples from her pocket, the last of her food, and divided them carefully. "Here," she said, giving the larger portions to the boys. "Eat slowly, make them last." She placed 2 pieces beside Hawk, though he seemed too feverish to notice. As night settled outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's door in its frame. Jonas pressed close to Isabel's side again, while Anthony sat rigid nearby, fighting sleep. "You should rest," Hawk said suddenly, his voice clearer than it had been all day. "You've done more than anyone could ask, Mrs. Boone." Isabel shook her head. "Don't thank me yet, Mr. Redden. This is temporary, remember? Just until you're able to travel again." But even as she said the words, she felt Jonas's small hand slip into hers, felt Anthony's watchful gaze, and knew that nothing about this situation was truly temporary. The wind moaned around the cabin's corners, driving snow against the single window. Inside, the stove's warmth and the day's exhaustion began to work their spell. Jonas fell asleep first, his head heavy against Isabel's arm. Anthony fought it longer, but eventually slumped against the wall, his father's rifle still clutched in his hands. Isabel stayed awake, watching the fires glow through the stove's cracked door. Hawk's breathing had steadied, though she could tell by its rhythm that he wasn't truly sleeping. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but within these rough walls, they had found a moment of peace. She thought about the farm she'd lost, about how quickly life could change its course. Yesterday morning she'd been alone, with nothing but her grief for company. Now she sat in a trapper's abandoned cabin, watching over 3 wounded souls who needed her, whether she was ready for that responsibility or not. The stove popped and settled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Jonas stirred in his sleep, and Isabel automatically smoothed his hair, the gesture as natural as breathing. Across the room, she caught Hawk watching her, his eyes reflecting the fire's glow. Neither spoke. There was too much to say, and no words yet to say it. Instead, they shared the silence, broken only by the wind's cry and the soft breathing of sleeping children. The storm raged on outside, but here, in this moment, they had found shelter, not just from the snow, but from the wilderness of their separate griefs. The broken stool, the dirt floor, the rusted stove, none of it mattered. They were warm, they were safe, and they were together. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The bullet that needed removing. The food they didn't have. The decisions that couldn't be postponed forever. But for now, Isabel let herself simply be still, holding Jonas's small hand in hers, listening to Anthony's steady breathing, feeling the weight of Hawk's unspoken gratitude across the darkened room. Wind rattled the cabin door once more, but none of them stirred. They had walked far today, in more ways than one. As Isabel finally allowed her own eyes to close, she realized that every step had led them here, not just to this cabin, but to each other. In the hollow hours before dawn, Isabel sat near the rusted stove, feeding it small sticks to keep the flame alive. The boys slept deeply, exhausted from yesterday's journey. Hawk's breathing was shallow but steady, though occasionally he would mutter and shift, caught in fever dreams. Unable to rest, Isabel decided to make herself useful. She rose quietly and began examining the cabin in the dim firelight. Dust and debris littered every surface. In one corner, she found an old corn broom with half its bristles missing. It would do. Working methodically, she swept the dirt floor, gathering years of leaves and pine needles that had blown in through gaps in the walls. The physical work helped calm her mind. As she cleaned, Isabel discovered small treasures: a dented tin cup behind the stove, a wooden spoon wedged between wall logs, even a cracked but usable cooking pot. Each find felt like a gift, something to make their temporary shelter more livable. Near the window, she spotted a row of rusty nails hammered into a beam. Perfect for hanging things to dry, she thought, already planning ahead. The practical tasks helped push away darker worries about Corman's men, about the bullet still in Hawk's leg, about how long they could survive here. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, Isabel pulled her shawl tight and stepped outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that sparkled in the growing light. The air was sharp and clean in her lungs. She remembered passing some old snare lines yesterday, marked by notches on trees. Following the fresh snow, she tracked the trapline about 50 paces from the cabin. The first 2 snares were empty, their wire loops hanging loose. But at the third, she found success: a plump snowshoe rabbit, its fur already turned winter white. "Thank you," she whispered, both to the rabbit and to Providence, as she gathered her prize. The meat would make a desperately needed meal, and she could use the fur to line mittens for Jonas, whose hands always seemed cold. Back at the cabin, she found Anthony awake and alert, rifle across his knees. "Just me," she said softly, showing him the rabbit. His eyes brightened at the sight of fresh meat. While the boys still slept, Isabel worked efficiently outside, cleaning the rabbit and saving everything useful. Even the small bones could make broth. Inside, she set water to heat in the cracked pot and added pieces of meat, along with some wild onions she'd spotted near the snare. The smell of cooking food gradually roused Jonas, who watched her work with solemn curiosity. She showed him how to stir the stew carefully, letting him feel useful. The boy's small hands gripped the wooden spoon with fierce concentration. After they'd eaten their small portions, Isabel turned her attention to Hawk's wound. The bandages needed changing, but she'd used the last clean cloth yesterday. Searching through his pack for anything that might serve, she found a spare shirt that could be torn into strips. As she dug deeper, her fingers brushed something hard wrapped in leather. Curious, she drew out a packet sealed with wax, its surface smooth from being carried close. She shouldn't pry, she knew, but something about its careful wrapping spoke of importance. The wax seal cracked easily. Inside, she found papers, several of them, carefully preserved. Her eyes widened as she read. There were maps showing water diversions from Clear Creek, altered to flow only to Corman's lands, deeds with dates scratched out and rewritten. Most damning of all, signed confessions from 2 of Corman's former men, detailing years of extortion and violence against honest settlers. "Those papers cost my wife her life." Isabel startled at Hawk's voice, rough with pain but fully aware. His eyes were open, watching her steadily. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, moving to return the packet. "I shouldn't have—" "No," he interrupted. "You needed to know. Those documents prove Corman's been stealing water rights for years, forcing good folks off their land with false claims and threats. My Mary—" His voice caught for a moment. "She was helping gather evidence, working with families who'd lost their farms. Corman's men found out." Isabel's hand went to her throat, understanding dawning. "That's why they shot you. Why you're running." Hawk nodded grimly. "Those papers could ruin him, return water rights to honest ranchers, but they have to reach Clear Creek to the circuit judge." He paused, pain tightening his features. "I thought I could make it alone with the boys, but now Corman's men are hunting you," Isabel finished softly. She looked at Anthony and Jonas with new understanding. No wonder the older boy was so watchful, the younger so silent. They carried far more than the weight of their mother's death. "We have to reach Clear Creek," Hawk insisted, trying to push himself upright. "Every day we delay gives Corman more time to cover his tracks." Isabel pressed him gently back down. "You can barely move with that bullet in your leg. Clear Creek is 3 days' hard ride in good weather. Right now it might as well be the moon." "Help me up," he demanded. "I need to know how far I can walk." She wanted to refuse, to insist he rest, but she recognized the steel in his voice. With Anthony's help, they got Hawk to his feet. He swayed dangerously, face going pale, but remained standing through sheer willpower. "See?" he said through gritted teeth. "I can manage." But when he tried to take a step, his injured leg buckled. Isabel and Anthony barely caught him before he fell. Even that small effort left him sweating and shaking. "3 steps," Isabel said firmly, helping him back to his blankets. "That's all you can manage right now. The truth won't matter if you die trying to deliver it." Hawk subsided, clearly exhausted by even that small effort. But his eyes remained worried, fixed on his son's. Isabel followed his gaze, understanding his fear. Every hour they stayed here was another hour Corman's men could find them. She carefully rewrapped the leather packet and tucked it deep in Hawk's pack. The weight of its contents seemed to fill the small cabin. What had felt like temporary shelter now felt exposed, vulnerable. The documents that could bring justice were also the ones that made them targets. Jonas came to lean against her side, seeking comfort without words. She wrapped an arm around his thin shoulders, feeling the tremors he tried to hide. Looking at his small face, at Anthony's 2 old eyes, at Hawk's helpless frustration, Isabel knew their lives had just become entangled beyond any hope of remaining temporary. The morning sun streamed through the cabin's single window, catching dust motes in its beam. Outside, snow continued to melt from pine boughs, dripping steadily. The sound marked time passing, precious time they couldn't afford to waste. But as she watched Hawk's eyes close in exhausted sleep, Isabel knew they had no choice but to wait. His leg needed healing before they could even think about traveling. Until then, they would have to trust in Providence, in the cabin's rough shelter, and in each other. She squeezed Jonas's shoulder gently and rose to check the remnants of the stew. They would need every bit of strength they could gather. Clear Creek and justice might have to wait, but survival couldn't. For now, that would have to be enough. The morning light revealed the stark truth. Hawk could barely move, let alone walk. Isabel watched him struggle just to sit upright, his face tight with pain, and knew they needed a better solution for travel. "The travois we made yesterday won't do for a longer journey," she said, examining the hastily lashed branches. "Anthony, help me gather stronger poles. We need something that will last." Anthony nodded, already scanning the tree line. He had his father's eye for good wood, Isabel noticed. Together they found 2 young pine trunks, straight and strong. Using Hawk's knife, they stripped the branches, leaving smooth poles that would slide easier over snow. "Jonas," Isabel called gently to the younger boy, who hovered near his father. "Would you help gather pine boughs? We need soft ones to cushion the travois." Jonas's eyes brightened at having a task. He moved carefully through the snow, selecting the freshest branches, with surprising care. Isabel showed him how to weave them together, creating a thick pad that would both insulate and protect his father from the rough ground. "That's fine work," she praised, and though Jonas didn't speak, his small smile warmed her heart. The rebuilt travois took most of the morning. Isabel used strips torn from her petticoat to lash the crosspieces, testing each knot. Anthony worked alongside her, his movements quick and sure. When they finally helped Hawk onto the improved bed of pine boughs, he nodded in approval. "It'll hold," he said, though Isabel could see how much even that small movement cost him. "We need to head northeast. Clear Creek's about 2 days' journey in good weather." Isabel looked at the heavy sky, knowing winter would make the trip longer, but they had no choice. The cabin was too exposed, and Corman's men could find them any day. She secured their few supplies and helped Anthony position himself at the front of the travois. "I'll pull first," she said, settling the leather harness across her shoulders. "You scout ahead, Anthony. Jonas, stay close to your father." They set out as snow began falling again, fat flakes that melted on Isabel's face. The going was slow, each step measured against the weight of the travois and the treacherous ground. Anthony moved ahead like a young deer, testing the path, while Jonas walked beside the travois, one hand always touching the edge near his father. By afternoon, the snow thickened. They passed through narrow cuts in the granite, where the walls rose steep and close. Isabel's shoulders ached from pulling, but she pressed on, knowing they needed to make distance while light lasted. At a shallow creek, partially frozen, they paused to refill their water flask and rest briefly. "Bear right at the next rise," Hawk directed from the travois, his voice rough with pain. "There's a sheltered ridge ahead. Good place to camp." Isabel nodded, grateful for his knowledge of the land. The ridge he'd mentioned appeared as the light began to fade, a natural windbreak with a deep overhang of rock, perfect for their needs. "Anthony, help me get your father settled," she said, carefully maneuvering the travois under the overhang. "Jonas, see if you can find any dry wood nearby." While the boys worked, Isabel checked Hawk's wound. The bandage needed changing, and she could feel heat rising from his skin. Not good signs, but she kept her worry from her face. Instead, she used the last of their clean cloth to rebind his leg, her touches gentle. "Thank you," Hawk murmured, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Rest," she replied simply. "We're safe enough for now." The boys returned with arms full of wood, and soon Isabel had a small fire crackling. She stretched the remaining rabbit meat into a thin stew, adding the last of their wild onions for flavor. As they ate, huddled close to the flames, she noticed how quiet the children were, worn down by the day's journey. "Would you like to hear a story?" she asked, remembering how her own mother's tales had comforted her on hard nights. "When I was a girl, not much older than you, Anthony, my pa kept bees." She told them about the summer she'd helped her father with the hives, how she'd learned to move slow and steady so the bees would accept her presence. She described the sweet, golden honey, the gentle humming of the workers, the way her mother had used honey to heal cuts and burns. The boys leaned closer as she spoke, drawn in by the warm memories. Even Jonas's eyes grew heavy, his small body relaxing against her side. Anthony tried to stay alert, but she could see fatigue winning over his young shoulders. My mother used to say bees were God's reminder that sweet things come from hard work, she finished softly. That, and having faith in small miracles. She glanced at Hawk and found him watching her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or gratitude. Then he closed his eyes, giving in to his own exhaustion. Near midnight, the wind began to roar across the ridge. Isabel had managed to get both boys properly settled, wrapped in what blankets they had, but now the fire threatened to fail under the gusts. She stayed awake, feeding it carefully, using her body to shield the flames when necessary. The wind spoke with many voices, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a scream. Isabel pulled her shawl tighter, watching over her sleeping charges. Hawk's fever worried her, and tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, they were together and sheltered, and she would make sure they stayed warm. Dawn broke pale and cold over their makeshift camp, painting the snow in shades of pearl and rose. Isabel, still awake, watched the light change. Despite her fatigue, hope stirred in her chest. They had survived their first night on the trail. Whatever came next, they would face it together. She stirred the fire's embers, adding small sticks to build it back to life. Soon she would wake the others, and they would continue their journey. But for now she let them sleep, these three who had somehow become her responsibility. The morning light touched their faces, softening worry lines and grief, making them look, for a moment, at peace. The morning dawned bitter cold, frost coating their blankets like delicate lace. Isabel shook the boys awake gently while checking on Hawk. His skin felt warmer than it should, but they had no choice except to press on. "We need to make good time today," she said, helping Anthony secure the travois straps. "Your father mentioned a friend who might help us, Old Vinegar Joe. Do you know him?" Anthony nodded, adjusting the leather across his shoulders. "Pa traded with him sometimes. He lives up near the high meadow." They broke camp quickly, sharing the last heel of bread before setting out. The snow had stopped, but heavy clouds threatened more. Isabel took the first turn pulling the travois, while Anthony scouted ahead and Jonas walked beside his father, one small hand resting on the wooden frame. By midday, the temperature rose enough to turn the snow to slush, making the going treacherous. They stopped to rest beneath a stand of blue spruce, and Isabel checked on Hawk. His face was flushed, eyes bright with fever. "Isabel," he mumbled, reaching for her hand. "The boys." "They're right here," she assured him, pressing her palm to his forehead. The heat radiating from his skin frightened her. "Try to rest. We'll reach Joe's place soon." Anthony appeared at her shoulder, worry clear in his young face. "Pa's worse, isn't he?" Isabel couldn't lie to him. "The fever's rising. We need to hurry." They pushed on through the afternoon, Isabel and Anthony taking shorter turns with the travois to maintain a faster pace. Jonas kept close watch on his father, his small face pinched with concern. When Hawk began muttering in his fever sleep, the boy's eyes filled with tears. "Look there," Isabel said quickly, pointing ahead to distract him. "See that thin line of smoke? That must be Joe's place." The cabin appeared as they crested a low rise. a solid structure of logs and stone nestled against the mountainside. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. Isabel's shoulders sagged with relief. Before they reached the cabin door, it swung open. Old Vinegar Joe stood in the doorway, his weather-worn face creasing with recognition. Though years had passed since Isabel had last seen him, he looked much the same. Tall and lean, his gray-streaked hair bound back with a leather tie, his movements measured and deliberate. "Isabel Boone," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "Didn't expect to see you up this high." His dark eyes took in the travois and the boys. "Looks like trouble's found you." "Joe, please. Hawk Reddin's been shot. He's burning with fever." Joe moved quickly then, helping Isabel and Anthony maneuver the travois through the door. Together they lifted Hawk onto Joe's own bed, a simple frame heaped with furs. The trapper examined the wound with gentle fingers, his expression grave. "Bullet's gone clean through, but infection's set in." He moved to his shelves, selecting dried herbs and roots. "Anthony, fetch water from the creek. Jonas, help me feed this fire higher. Isabel, there's clean cloth in that chest. We'll need it all." They worked together as Joe brewed strong-smelling tea and prepared poultices of herbs. Isabel recognized some from her grandmother-in-law's teachings: yarrow, echinacea, willow bark. Joe worked with quiet efficiency, his hands sure as he cleaned and treated the wound. "This tea will help break the fever," he said, lifting Hawk's head to help him drink. "But he needs rest and warmth to heal proper." While Joe tended to Hawk, Isabel prepared a simple supper from Joe's stores: bean soup with dried meat and the last of their bread. The boys ate hungrily, some of the days, tension easing from their shoulders in the cabin's warmth. After the meal, Joe motioned Isabel to join him by the fire. His expression was troubled as he spoke in low tones. "There's something you need to know," he said, glancing at the boys who were settling into their bedrolls. "Corman's posted bounties on the Reddins, all 3 of them. Alive or dead doesn't matter to him." Isabel's heart clenched. "How much?" "Enough to turn honest men dishonest. His riders have been seen in the foothills, asking questions." Joe's voice dropped lower. "And there's more. The sheriff in Clear Creek, Hardwick, he's in Corman's pocket. Has been for years." Isabel watched the firelight play across the sleeping boys' faces. "Then we can't go to Clear Creek. But the evidence Hawk carries needs to reach honest hands," Joe agreed. "But you'll have to be careful who you trust. Corman's influence runs deep." Hawk stirred on the bed, muttering in his fever dreams. Isabel moved to his side, dipping a cloth in cool water to wipe his brow. His skin felt less hot, the fever beginning to break under Joe's remedies. "You should rest," Joe said, spreading another blanket near the fire. "Way I see it, you're safer here tonight than pushing on in the dark. We can talk more in the morning." Isabel nodded, exhaustion suddenly heavy in her bones. But she remained beside Hawk, watching the fever's flush slowly fade from his cheeks. The fire crackled low, and Joe's quiet movements as he checked his traps and stores created a peaceful rhythm. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf called to the rising moon. Inside, the boys slept deeply, their faces smoothed of worry and slumber. Isabel continued her vigil beside Hawk, dabbing his forehead with the cool cloth, hoping they could stay ahead of the dangers pursuing them. She thought of Corman's riders searching the foothills, of the corrupt sheriff waiting in Clear Creek, of the precious documents that could bring justice, if only they could deliver them safely. The task seemed impossible, yet she knew they had to try. Hawk's breathing grew steadier as his fever broke, but Isabel kept her post. In the firelight's glow, she studied his face, the strong lines softened by sleep, the worry furrow between his brows finally smooth. His hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers curling weakly around her own. The gesture startled her, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she sat in the quiet cabin, listening to the peaceful sounds of sleep around her, and wondered how she had come to care so deeply for these 3 lost souls in such a short time. Joe's warning echoed in her mind. They would have to be careful who they trusted. But looking at the sleeping family around her, Isabel knew with certainty that she trusted them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Dawn crept over the mountains in ribbons of pale gold. Inside Joe's cabin, the scent of coffee and frying bacon roused Isabel from her light sleep. She found Joe already at work over his iron stove, his movements quiet and efficient. "Can't send folks out hungry," he said, nodding toward a pot of bubbling porridge, especially not with the journey ahead. The boys stirred at the smell of food, Anthony helping Jonas fold their bedrolls while Isabel checked on Hawk. His fever had broken completely during the night, though weakness still clouded his eyes. "Need to get moving," Hawk muttered, trying to sit up. "After you eat," Joe insisted, ladling generous portions into tin bowls. He added dried berries and honey to the porridge, treating them to luxuries Isabel hadn't tasted in months. The boys ate eagerly, some of their usual wariness softening in the safety of Joe's cabin. Even Hawk managed several spoonfuls before resting back against the pillows, his strength still fragile. While Anthony helped Jonas wash the breakfast dishes, Joe beckoned Isabel outside. Morning frost sparkled on the pine needles, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. Joe's expression was grave as he spoke. "There's something you need to know about Hawk's situation," he said, keeping his voice low. "Something he ain't told you himself." Isabel wrapped her shawl tighter. "What is it?" "Before his wife died, they filed a secret homestead claim." Joe glanced toward the cabin. "On land that holds the region's only reliable spring. Been keeping it quiet these past years, waiting for the right time to record it public." The weight of this revelation settled heavily on Isabel's shoulders. "That's what Corman's really after." Joe nodded. "That spring's the source of his power. Controls most water rights in 3 counties through illegal diversions. But if Hawk and those boys survive to record their claim..." He let the sentence hang. "His entire water empire collapses," Isabel finished. The pieces clicked into place. Corman's ruthlessness, the bounties, the desperate pursuit. "Does Hawk know you're telling me this?" "Reckon he needs to trust someone besides me with the truth." Joe pulled a sturdy wooden crutch from behind a woodpile. "Made this for him last night. He'll need it, and you, more than he admits." They returned inside to find Hawk attempting to stand, Anthony supporting his father's weight. Joe handed over the crutch without comment, but his eyes met Hawk's in silent communication. The morning sun had burned away the frost by the time they prepared to leave. Joe provided them with supplies: dried meat, hard biscuits, extra bandages, and a small pot of healing salve. He helped settle Hawk on the travois, though the mountain man insisted he would walk part of the way. "Remember what I said about Clear Creek," Joe warned as they readied to depart. "Watch your backs." The day warmed slowly as they descended through stands of aspen and pine. Hawk managed short stretches walking with the crutch, though the effort left him pale and sweating. During Pho, their midday rest, Isabel knew she could no longer keep silent about what she'd learned. They stopped in a small meadow, sheltered by granite outcrops. While the boys gathered wood for a small fire, Isabel helped Hawk settle against a sun-warmed boulder. "Joe told me about the spring," she said quietly. "About the homestead claim." Hawk's expression tightened. "Figured he might." "Why didn't you tell me?" He was silent for a long moment, watching his sons arrange kindling for the fire. Thought I was protecting them by keeping quiet. Their mother. His voice roughened. She died protecting those papers. Wouldn't tell Corman's men where they were hidden, even when... Isabel laid her hand over his. The boys deserve to know why she died. Hawk nodded slowly. Anthony, he called. Jonas, come here a minute. The boys approached, Jonas pressing close to his brother's side as always. Hawk gestured for them to sit, his face solemn. There's something you need to understand about why we're running, he began. About why your mama... He swallowed hard. Why she fought so hard to protect certain papers. Anthony's young face was intent as Hawk explained about the spring, the secret claim, and what it meant. Jonas listened with wide eyes, his small hand finding Isabel's and holding tight. Your mama knew how important that spring was, Hawk continued. How many honest farmers depend on that water? She wouldn't let Corman steal it, even when... He couldn't finish. That's why she told us to run, Anthony said softly. Why she made us promise to keep the papers safe. Hawk nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. She was the bravest person I ever knew. Jonas suddenly spoke, his first words since his mother's death. She said we had to protect the water. For everyone. The sound of his voice brought tears to Isabel's eyes. Anthony hugged his little brother close, his own face wet with emotion. Yes, little one, Hawk whispered. That's exactly what she said. They rested longer than planned, the weight of shared grief and understanding creating a deeper bond between them. When they finally continued their journey, Isabel noticed both boys walking closer to their father, as if their mother's sacrifice had given them new strength. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they descended into the foothill basin. Hawk managed longer stretches with the crutch now, though Isabel stayed close in case his strength failed. The boys ranged ahead, Anthony pointing out landmarks to his brother. As dusk approached, they crested a low rise and saw a clear creek spread out below them. The town's lights were just beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness, still several miles distant across the open basin. Hawk leaned on his crutch, studying the town with wary eyes. We'll need to be careful how we approach, he said. Corman's men will be watching the main roads. Isabel nodded, remembering Joe's warning about the corrupt sheriff. She looked at their small group, a wounded man, 2 young boys, and herself, facing the power of a ruthless water baron. The odds seemed impossible. But then Jonas slipped his small hand into hers, while Anthony stood straight-backed beside his father, ready to help him walk. And Isabel remembered why they were fighting, not just for justice, but for all the families who needed that spring water to survive. They made camp in a sheltered hollow, keeping their fire small to avoid detection. As night settled over the basin, Isabel watched the distant lights of Clear Creek and thought of their journey ahead. Whatever dangers waited in that town, they would face them together. The sound of Jonas's voice, breaking his long silence, echoed in her mind, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal, that courage could be found in the most unlikely moments. Tomorrow they would need every ounce of that courage to face what waited in Clear Creek. But tonight, gathered around their small fire, they were simply a family sharing warmth and trust beneath the vast Colorado sky. The sunset painted the western sky in deep purples and golds as Isabel helped Hawk settle against a fallen log. They had found a sheltered clearing just beyond Clear Creek's outskirts, hidden from the main road by a thick stand of cottonwoods. The town's evening bells echoed across the basin, marking 6 o'clock. Best to wait for full dark, Hawk said, adjusting his leg with a grimace. Fewer eyes watching the streets then. Isabel nodded, unpacking their meager supplies, while Anthony gathered kindling for a small fire. Jonas stayed close to his brother's side, his eyes darting nervously toward the distant town lights beginning to flicker in windows. "Anthony," Isabel called softly. "Come here a moment. You too, Jonas." The boys approached as she knelt beside their small fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across their young faces, reminding her how vulnerable they were. "Tomorrow when we reach town, things might get complicated," she began, choosing her words carefully. "We need to have a plan for keeping Jonas safe in crowds." Anthony's expression turned serious. "What kind of plan?" "Here, let me show you." Isabel positioned the boys side by side. "Jonas, you'll stay right behind your brother, close enough to touch his back. Anthony, you'll feel him there and know he's safe without having to look." She guided them through the movements, teaching Anthony to shield his younger brother with subtle shifts of his body. Jonas practiced staying in his brother's shadow, his small hand gripping the back of Anthony's jacket. "That's right," Isabel encouraged. "Just like that. And if anything happens—" She paused, meeting Anthony's steady gaze. "If we get separated, you keep Jonas close and head straight for the church. Don't stop for anyone." Hawk watched the practice session from his place by the log, his face softening at Isabel's patient instruction. When the boys returned to tending the fire, he beckoned her closer. "There's someone in town we can trust," he said quietly. "Reverend Saul Walker, half Ute, half Anglo, knows every family for 50 miles and won't be bought by Corman's money." Isabel settled beside him. "Where can we find him?" "Church is on Cedar Street, white clapboard with blue trim. Living quarters are around back." Hawk's voice dropped lower. "If anything happens to me, get those papers to him. He'll know what to do." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Isabel insisted, but she memorized the details anyway. The evening deepened into true darkness. Jonas fell asleep curled against his brother's side while Isabel prepared their supper. The beans and salt pork weren't much, but the warm meal brought color back to Hawk's pale face. Anthony stayed awake long after his brother dozed off, watching the stars emerge above the cottonwoods. "Ma used to say every star was an angel keeping watch," he said softly. Isabel touched his shoulder gently. "Then we have quite a few watching over us tonight." They took turns keeping watch through the night, though no riders passed near their hidden camp. As false dawn began painting the eastern sky in pale gray, Isabel woke the boys and helped them pack their few belongings. Hawk insisted on walking, leaning heavily on Joe's crutch. His jaw was set with determination as they began their careful approach toward town, staying within the tree cover that lined the road. Jonas kept perfect position behind his brother, just as they had practiced. The morning sun climbed higher as they drew closer to Clear Creek's outskirts. The familiar sounds of a frontier town starting its day reached them. Wagon wheels creaking, horses nickering from the livery stable, a distant church bell marking 8 o'clock. "Remember," Hawk murmured, as they paused in the shadow of the livery. "Quick and quiet, straight to the church." Isabel positioned herself to shield the boys, her heart pounding as they stepped onto the packed dirt of Clear Creek's main street. Hawk limped beside them, his face tight with pain, but his eyes alert and scanning. The street seemed peaceful enough. A few early merchants swept their boardwalks, while a wagon loaded with flour barrels rattled past. No one paid their small group much attention. They had covered perhaps half the distance to Cedar Street when Anthony's hand suddenly gripped Isabel's skirt. "Ma," he whispered, the word slipping out naturally in his fear. "That rider at the end of the street, he's watching us." Isabel's chest tightened as she glimpsed the mounted figure Anthony had spotted. The man sat motionless on his horse, too far to make out his face, but there was no mistaking his intent focus on their group. Hawk's hand closed around her arm, his fingers urgent. "Walk faster," he whispered. "Don't run, but don't stop." Isabel quickened her pace, guiding the boys with gentle pressure on their shoulders. Jonas pressed closer to his brother, breathing quick and shallow. The rider at the street's end hadn't moved, but Isabel could feel his eyes following their progress. The morning sun beat down on their backs as they hurried forward, each step seeming to take an eternity. The white clapboard church with its blue trim was visible now, perhaps another 200 yards ahead. But the weight of that watching gaze made the distance feel impossible to cross. The church's white clapboard walls gleamed in the morning sun, seeming close enough to touch. Isabel kept her pace steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Jonas's small form pressed against her skirt, while Anthony walked alert beside them, his eyes constantly scanning the street. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the quiet. Wood splintered near Isabel's head as the bullet struck a hitching post. Screams erupted from the boardwalk as townspeople scattered in panic. More shots followed, and Isabel glimpsed men emerging from the shadowed alleyways, rifles raised. "Get down!" Hawk lunged forward, shoving Anthony behind a freight wagon. His crutch clattered to the street as he drew his revolver. Isabel wrapped her arms around Jonas and dove behind a stack of feed sacks, pulling him close against her chest. The boy trembled violently, his mouth open in a silent scream. Across the street, women grabbed their children and fled into shops while men ducked for cover. "Corman's men!" Anthony shouted from behind the wagon. "They're coming from both sides." Hawk fired twice at the nearest gunman, forcing him back into the alley, but his wounded leg buckled as he tried to move to better cover. Isabel saw the strain on his face as he struggled to stay upright. A second rifle cracked. Hawk jerked backward, crimson blooming across his left shoulder. His gun fell from nerveless fingers as he collapsed against the wagon wheel, leaving a smear of blood on the weathered wood. "Pa!" Anthony started to run toward his father, but Hawk's sharp command froze him in place. "Stay down!" Two men in dust-covered dusters emerged from beside the general store, moving with practiced efficiency. Before Isabel could cry out a warning, they seized Jonas, ripping him from her grasp. The boy's face contorted in silent terror as they dragged him toward the stockyards. "Jonas!" Isabel's scream echoed off the buildings. She lunged after them, but bullets kicked up dirt at her feet, driving her back. "This way!" She grabbed Anthony's arm and pulled him toward the nearest stable. They ducked inside just as more shots splintered the doorframe. The musty darkness swallowed them as they crouched behind stacked hay bales, trying to control their panicked breathing. Outside, boots crunched on packed earth. A horse nickered nervously. Then a familiar voice spoke, smooth as poisoned honey. "Mrs. Boone." Miles Corman's words carried clearly through the stable's wooden walls. "I must say, you've caused me quite a bit of trouble. Far more than a simple widow ought to." Isabel pressed Anthony closer to the hay bales, feeling him shake with fury and fear. She could see a sliver of the street through a gap between boards. Corman sat easily on his black stallion, wearing a fine wool coat despite the dust and violence. Two of his men flanked him, rifles ready. "Come now," Corman continued. "Let's discuss this like civilized folk. No need for anyone else to get hurt today." Hawk's voice rose weakly from where he lay. "Don't listen to him, Isabel." A gesture from Corman, and one of his men kicked Hawk's wounded shoulder. The mountain man's grunt of pain made Anthony flinch. "I can be reasonable," Corman said, "but my patience has limits. Show yourself now, and perhaps we can come to an arrangement regarding the boy." Isabel's mind raced. Jonas was being taken to the stock pens. Hawk lay bleeding in the street, and she had no way to know if Reverend Walker was even in town to help them. Before she could form a plan, the stable's back door burst open. 2 more of Corman's men rushed in, guns drawn. Isabel tried to pull Anthony deeper into the shadows, but rough hands seized them both. They were dragged out into the harsh sunlight. One man quickly found the small knife hidden in Isabel's skirts and tossed it away. Anthony struggled until a pistol pressed against his temple. "Ah, there you are." Corman smiled down at them, but his eyes remained cold. "I do apologize for the rough handling, but you've left me little choice. I can't have you interfering in matters that don't concern you." "Jonas is just a child," Isabel said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Whatever quarrel you have with Hawk, this stopped being about Redden the moment you chose to help him." Corman's smile vanished. "You could have walked away. Should have. Now you'll have to live with that choice." He turned to his men. "Take the boy to join his brother at the stock pens. Mrs. Boone and I need to have a private conversation about certain documents she might have seen." Isabel met Hawk's anguished gaze as 2 men grabbed her arms. Blood soaked his shirt, and his face had gone gray with pain, but his eyes burned with helpless rage as he watched Corman's men drag Isabel away. "You won't get away with this," Hawk ground out. "The law—" "The law," Corman laughed. "My dear man, I am the law in these parts, and it's time everyone remembered that." He wheeled his horse around. "Bring her to my office, and make sure Redden doesn't bleed out just yet. I want him conscious for what comes next." As they pulled her toward Corman's building, Isabel caught a final glimpse of Anthony being forced toward the stockyards, his face streaked with angry tears. Beyond him, the white church stood silent under the morning sun, its promise of sanctuary now seeming as distant as the stars. The stockyard office smelled of old hay and leather, its wooden walls weathered by years of harsh mountain winters. Isabel winced as rough rope bit into her wrists, securing her to a sturdy support post. Her shoulders ached from the tight binding, but she kept her face carefully neutral as she watched Corman's men shove Anthony into the corner nearby. The boy's eyes blazed with fury, though he stayed silent when one of the guards cuffed him sharply. A thin trail of blood trickled from his split lip, and Isabel had to fight down her rage at seeing him treated so roughly. Miles Corman settled himself behind the dusty desk, removing his leather gloves with deliberate slowness. Outside, the winter sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows. The sound of horses nickering and men's voices drifted in from the yard. "Now then, Mrs. Boone," Corman said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "Let's discuss the leather packet Redden was carrying, the one containing certain sensitive documents." Isabel met his gaze steadily. "I don't have it. We lost everything during our flight through the mountains." "Did you now?" Corman's fingers drummed against the desk's scarred surface. "Strange. My men searched your trail quite thoroughly. Found plenty of signs of your passing, but no dropped items." "The snow was heavy," Isabel said. "It would have covered any—" The crack of Corman's hand against the desk made her flinch. "Do not test my patience, madam. I know Redden showed you those papers. I know you understand what they contain." He leaned forward, all pretense of civility vanishing. "Tell me where they are, or I will be forced to make an example of your mountain man friend." From somewhere nearby, a muffled whimper drew Isabel's attention. Through a gap in the wall planks, she could see into an adjacent feed stall where Jonas huddled in the corner. The boy's face was tear-streaked, his silent cries breaking her heart. "Leave them out of this," Isabel said. "The boys have done nothing to you." On the contrary, Corman stood, pacing slowly around the desk. "They're Redden's sons. That makes them part of this mess their father started." He paused beside Anthony, resting a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. Anthony went rigid, but didn't pull away. "Such a shame to see children pay for their parents' poor choices." Isabel's wrists worked subtly against the rawhide bindings. A steady drip, drip, drip of melting snow leaked through the roof nearby, and she inched closer to let the water splash against the ropes. If she could just keep Corman talking long enough? "What poor choices?" she asked. "Defending honest water rights? Protecting his family's land claim?" Corman's laugh held no humor. "Honest? There's nothing honest about this territory, Mrs. Boone. Men like Redden, clinging to their pathetic dreams of independence. They're relics. The future belongs to those who understand how to properly manage resources." He moved to the window, gazing out at the stockyard. "This land needs order. Structure. My kind of structure." "You mean theft and murder?" His hand cracked across her face before she could brace herself. The taste of copper filled her mouth as her split lip began to bleed. Anthony surged forward with a cry of protest, but the guard grabbed him roughly. "I've built something here," Corman snarled. "Something that works. I won't let some stubborn trapper and a meddling widow destroy it." He straightened his coat, visibly collecting himself. "Jenkins, gather the men. I want Redden strung up before sunset. Let everyone see what happens to those who defy progress." "No!" Isabel strained against her bonds. "Please, he's injured. He needs a doctor." "He needs a rope." Corman smiled coldly. "But first, I need those documents." He turned to his men. "I'm going to round up the rest of our riders. Watch them closely. When I return, Mrs. Boone will either tell us where those papers are, or she'll watch Redden hang. Her choice." The office door slammed behind him. Outside, horses' hooves thundered away as Corman and several men rode out. Isabel counted 4 guards remaining, 2 in the office, 1 watching Jonas, and 1 presumably still guarding Hawk. The steady drip of snowmelt continued. Isabel worked her wrists carefully, feeling the rawhide begin to soften and stretch. Old Vinegar Joe's words came back to her. "Rawhide's strong when dry, girl, but get it wet, and it gives like a spring fawn's legs." Minutes crawled past. The winter sun sank lower, painting the office walls in deep orange. Anthony watched her intently from his corner, noting her subtle movements. Smart boy. He'd already figured out what she was attempting. Finally, after what felt like hours, Isabel felt the binding loosen enough to slip one hand free. She kept her arms behind the post, waiting for the right moment. The guards had grown bored, playing cards on Corman's desk. "Hey," one called suddenly. "The kid's getting too close to that wall." He stood, moving toward Anthony with clear menace. Isabel seized her chance. In one fluid motion, she pulled free of the loosened ropes and grabbed the heavy brass spittoon from beside the post. The first guard went down hard when she swung it against the back of his head. The second barely had time to reach for his gun before Anthony tackled his legs, sending him sprawling. Isabel snatched up the fallen guard's pistol, keeping it trained on the second man as Anthony quickly tied him with the same ropes that had held her. A quick search produced a ring of keys. "The feed stall," she whispered. "Get Jonas while I watch him." Anthony nodded and slipped out. Moments later, he returned with his brother clinging to him tightly. Jonas's face was tear-stained but determined as he gripped Anthony's hand. "There's a loose plank in the back wall," Anthony said softly. "I spotted it earlier. We can squeeze through." Isabel nodded. "The church on the hill. That's where Hawk said his friend would be. We'll have to be careful. There may be more guards." The gap Anthony had found was narrow but manageable. They emerged into the deepening dusk, keeping close to the caught shadows of the stockyard fence. In the distance, they could hear voices and movement as Corman's men gathered in the town. Jonas stumbled slightly, and Isabel scooped him up without breaking stride. The small church perched on its hill seemed impossibly far away, but it was their only hope. Hawk's life depended on reaching help before Corman returned. They crept through back alleys and behind buildings, freezing at every sound. The pistol felt heavy in Isabel's free hand, but she kept it ready. Anthony led the way, moving with the natural stealth she'd noticed in him from the beginning. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, they finally reached the base of the church hill. Isabel's heart pounded as she studied the open ground they would have to cross. Behind them, angry shouts rose from the direction of the stockyard. Their escape had been discovered. "We have to run for it," she whispered. "Ready?" Anthony nodded grimly. Jonas tightened his grip around her neck. Together they emerged from hiding and began their desperate dash toward the church above, praying they would find help waiting within its walls. Isabel burst through the heavy wooden church doors, her chest heaving from the climb. Anthony followed close behind, both of them blinking in the dim light filtering through dusty stained glass. The sweet scent of beeswax candles and pine floor soap filled the air. Reverend Saul Walker looked up from his sweeping, his weathered face creasing with concern. The broom clattered against a pew as he strode forward to meet them. "Mrs. Boone? What brings you—" He stopped short, taking in their disheveled appearance and the terror in their eyes. "Reverend Walker," Isabel managed between breaths. "Hawk Redden sent us. He said you would help." The preacher's expression sharpened. "Hawk? I haven't seen him in months, not since—" He gestured for them to follow him toward the back room. "Come, tell me everything." In the cramped church office, lit by a single oil lamp, Isabel quickly recounted the past day's events. She described finding Hawk wounded in the ravine, the boys' silent trauma, their difficult journey through the snow. Her voice grew urgent as she explained about the water rights evidence and Corman's pursuit. "And now they have Jonas," she finished, gripping the edge of Sewell's desk. "They're planning to hang Hawk at sunset unless we do something." Sewell's dark eyes had grown steadily harder as she spoke. He touched the silver cross at his throat, a gesture, Isabel noticed, that seemed more habit than conscious thought. "Miles Corman," he said quietly. "I've watched that man poison this town with his greed for 15 years. But murder?" He shook his head. "Even for him, this is bold." "Will you help us?" Anthony spoke up. His young face was fierce with determination. "Please, they'll kill my father." Sewell straightened, resolution settling over his features. "Of course we'll help. Wait here." He slipped out through the side door. Isabel could hear his boots on the packed earth outside, moving quickly. Anthony paced the small office while Isabel studied the maps on Sewell's walls. Trail markings, property boundaries, water sources. Her eyes caught on the location of Hawk's secret spring, understanding now why Corman wanted it so desperately. Within 20 minutes, Sewell returned with 3 men. He made quick introductions. Tom Reed, a lean ranch hand with quick eyes; May Collins, the town's schoolteacher who carried herself with quiet authority; and Marcus Webb, a retired cavalry scout whose silver hair belied his still-muscled frame. "These are people I trust with my life," Sewell said simply. "They'll help us." May Collins stepped forward, her stern face softening as she looked at Anthony. "We've heard rumors about Corman's schemes for years, but he's always been too careful to catch. Until now." "The stockyard," Marcus said, his voice gravel rough. "Tell us the layout." Isabel described everything she could remember: the office where she'd been held, the feed stall where they'd kept Jonas, the gaps between buildings. She sketched rough positions in the dust on Sewell's desk, while the others leaned in close. 4 guards when we left," she added, but Corman rode out to gather more men. He could return any minute. Sewell moved to a heavy oak cabinet in the corner. From a hidden compartment, he withdrew a polished Colt revolver and checked its chambers. "The Lord helps those who stand against evil," he said quietly, pressing the weapon into Isabel's hands. "But he doesn't mind if we help ourselves, too." The gun felt both foreign and necessary in Isabel's grip. She tucked it carefully into her belt as Sewell distributed more weapons, another revolver for Marcus, a rifle for Tom. May Collins pulled a brass lantern from beneath her shawl. "We'll need light. The moon's behind clouds tonight." "Too risky," Marcus began, but May shook her head. "More risky to stumble in the dark. We'll keep it shielded except when necessary." Sewell nodded approval, then turned to one of his regular parishioners who had appeared in the doorway. "Sister Martha, stay by the bell tower. If you see Corman's men approaching town in force, ring twice. That'll be our signal to move faster." The elderly woman nodded grimly and hurried toward the stairs. They gathered close as Sewell outlined the plan. "We'll approach from 3 directions. Marcus and Tom from the north, near the cattle pens. May and I will create a distraction from the main road. Isabel and Anthony, you know the back way in through that loose wall panel. Find Jonas first. He's the most vulnerable." "What about my father?" Anthony asked. "We'll get to him," Isabel promised, squeezing his shoulder. "But Jonas needs us most right now." Sewell checked his pocket watch in the lamplight. "It's just past 8 o'clock. The town will be settling in for the night, which works in our favor. But we need to move before Corman returns with reinforcements." They slipped out of the church one by one, May's lantern casting weak shadows across the packed dirt. The town below was oddly quiet, most windows already dark. A dog barked in the distance, then fell silent. Isabel felt her heart thundering as they crept through narrow alleys between buildings. Anthony stayed close to her side, his steps nearly as silent as his brothers usually were. The weight of the revolver at her hip reminded her of everything at stake. At the first cross street, they separated. Marcus and Tom melted into the shadows heading north, while Sewell and May continued toward the main road. Isabel caught May's eye one last time, saw the schoolteacher's determined nod, before she and Anthony turned toward their own approach. The stockyard loomed ahead, its wooden walls black against the night sky. Somewhere inside, Jonas waited. Somewhere nearby, Hawk fought to stay alive until they could reach him. Isabel gripped Anthony's hand once, then let go. They had work to do. Around them, the town held its breath. Above, the church bell waited, ready to sound its warning. And ahead, through the darkness, their small group moved forward with lantern light and desperate hope. Prayer and gunmetal, their only shields against what waited in the shadows. The midnight sky hung low and heavy with snow as Isabel and Anthony crept toward the north gate of the stockyard. Each careful step disappeared beneath fresh powder, nature itself conspiring to mask their approach. The cold bit through Isabel's worn coat, but she barely noticed, focused entirely on the dim shapes ahead. Reverend Saul and Marcus Webb, the retired scout, had already split off toward the south fence, their dark figures barely visible against the weathered wood. May Collins and Tom Reed held position near the main road, ready to provide covering fire if needed. Isabel pressed close to the rough planks, feeling splinters catch at her sleeve. Anthony moved like a shadow beside her, his young face set with determination. Through gaps in the fence, they could see a single oil lantern burning, its light pooling yellow in the snow. A guard hunched near the flame, stamping his feet against the cold. Beyond him, Isabel's heart clenched as she made out Jonas's small form huddled in the corner of a feed stall. The boy sat absolutely still, arms wrapped around his knees, his silence now a shield against fear. "We need to draw him away," Isabel whispered to Anthony, nodding toward the guard. Her eyes caught on a metal bucket propped against the fence. An idea formed. Carefully, she worked the bucket free, timing her movements with the guard's restless pacing. When he turned toward the lantern again, Isabel hurled the bucket hard against a nearby post. It crashed with a hollow clang that echoed through the stockyard. The guard spun, cursing. "Who's there?" His hand dropped to his holster as he stepped away from Jonas, moving toward the noise. That was all the opening Tom Reed needed. The ranch hand slipped from the shadows like a mountain cat, one arm locking around the guard's throat while his other hand clamped over the man's mouth. After a brief struggle, the guard went limp. Isabel was already running to Jonas. The boy launched himself into her arms, his small body trembling but blessedly whole. She pressed her face into his hair for just a moment, whispering, "I've got you, sweetheart. I've got you." Across the yard, she heard the soft thud of boots in snow, Sewell and Marcus working their way to where Hawk was bound. Isabel's chest tightened as she caught glimpses of him through the gaps between buildings. He slumped against a post, ropes cutting into his arms, head bowed. But he was alive. The rescue seemed almost too easy until a shout split the night. "Riders coming, at least 6. May Collins' warning carried clear through the cold air. Gunfire erupted from the direction of the main road. Isabel yanked Jonas behind a water trough as bullets splintered wood around them. Anthony darted from cover to cover, reaching his father just as Sewell and Marcus cut him free. Hawk stumbled, barely conscious. Anthony wedged himself under his father's arm, while Marcus took the other side. Together they half-carried, half-dragged him toward the relative safety of the alleyways. More shots crackled through the night. May Collins and Tom Reed returned fire from their positions, buying precious seconds. Isabel clutched Jonas close, waiting for a break in the shooting. When it came, she scooped him up and ran, following Anthony's path through the yard. They made it to the first alley as church bells began tolling urgently, 2 sharp peals cutting through the gunfire. Sister Martha's warning that more of Corman's men approached. "This way," Sewell called from ahead, gesturing toward a narrow passage between buildings. They stumbled through deep snow, trying to stay quiet despite their panic. Jonas clung to Isabel's neck, his face buried against her shoulder. Hawk's labored breathing seemed too loud in the darkness. The bells continued their frantic warning as the small group fled deeper into the maze of back streets. Behind them, angry shouts and pounding hooves marked their pursuers' arrival. But the snow kept falling, covering their tracks, and the night wrapped around them like a protective cloak. They paused at an intersection, pressing close to cold brick walls. Isabel could feel Jonas's heart hammering against her chest. Anthony kept one hand on his father's arm, steadying him. The sound of searching men grew closer. Sewell pointed urgently toward a deeper shadow, another alley leading toward the church. One by one, they slipped into its darkness. The bells rang on, calling them home, warning them forward, their bronze voices cutting through the snowy night like signals of hope. The church bells rang a 3rd time, their urgent peals echoing through the snowy streets of Clear Creek. Townsfolk emerged from shops and homes, drawn by the traditional signal for emergency assembly. They gathered on the church steps, breath clouding in the cold air, faces confused and concerned. Isabel stood at the top of the steps beside Reverend Sewell, her hands trembling slightly as she held the leather packet. Jonas pressed against her skirts while Anthony supported his father, who leaned heavily against the church door. Lamplight from the church windows cast long shadows across the gathering crowd. "Good people of Clear Creek," Sewell's voice carried across the murmuring crowd. "What you're about to hear demands your full attention and moral courage." Isabel stepped forward, drawing strength from the weight of Jonas's small hand clutching her dress. She broke the wax seal and unfolded the documents with deliberate care. Her clear voice cut through the winter air. These are signed confessions and surveys proving that Miles Corman has illegally diverted water from legitimate claims. She held up a map marked with red lines. He's dammed Sawmill Creek, starving out honest ranchers downstream. Here are receipts showing bribes paid to turn away water inspectors. The crowd stirred uneasily. Mrs. Collins, the schoolmarm, pushed closer to see the documents herself. Isabel continued reading, her voice growing stronger. These papers detail how Corman forged deeds, threatened families, and seized land through false debts. She paused, looking directly at faces she recognized. Many of you have lost farms to his schemes. Some lost more than land. She glanced at Jonas, whose eyes were wide but steady. He put bounties on innocent children to hide his crimes. He tried to murder Hawk Redden and his sons to conceal the truth about their legal claim to Spring Valley. Angry mutters rippled through the crowd. Harlan Pike, the blacksmith, stepped forward, his massive arms crossed. I lost my south pasture to one of them debts. Never seemed right, but couldn't prove nothing. The sound of horses' hooves interrupted the revelation. Corman appeared at the edge of the crowd, flanked by 6 armed men. His face twisted with rage as he saw Isabel with the documents. That woman's a thief and a liar, he shouted, spurring his horse forward. But the crowd had shifted, forming a wall of bodies between Corman and the church steps. Mrs. Collins and Harlan Pike moved deliberately to stand before Isabel and the boys. Marcus Webb, the cavalry scout, raised his voice to carry across the square. The lies are yours, Corman. We've got proof of every water right you stole, every family you threatened, every false deed you filed. He turned to address the townspeople. This man put bounties on children, tried to hang a wounded man. How many more families must suffer? The crowd's anger was palpable now. 2 of Corman's own men exchanged uneasy looks, then deliberately holstered their weapons and backed their horses away. We didn't sign up for hurting kids, one called out, turning his horse around. Sheriff. Hardwick pushed through the crowd, his face gray with conflict. He studied the documents Isabel held, then looked at Jonas's frightened face and Hawk's bloody shoulder. All these years, he muttered, then squared his shoulders. Miles Corman, you're under arrest for fraud, attempted murder, and corruption of public office. You can't do this, Corman roared, reaching for his gun. But the crowd surged forward. Harlan Pike and 3 other men grabbed Corman's horse's bridle. More townspeople moved to surround his remaining men. I own this town, Corman thrashed as hands pulled him from his saddle. You're nothing without me, nothing. But his threats rang hollow now. The sheriff and his deputy clapped iron cuffs around Corman's wrists. As they dragged him toward the jail, scattered cheers broke out among the crowd. The sound grew, tentative at first, then swelling with relief and justice long denied. Isabel felt Jonas's grip on her skirts loosen slightly. When she looked down, the boy's face held the ghost of a smile, the first she'd seen since finding him in the ravine. Anthony stood straighter beside his father, chin lifted with pride. The townsfolk pressed closer, eager to examine the evidence for themselves. Sewell raised his hands for quiet, beginning to organize the next steps needed to right years of wrongs. But Isabel kept her attention on the small family beside her, watching hope slowly replace fear in their eyes as justice finally arrived in Clear Creek. Gray light filtered through the church's frosted windows as 4 men carefully carried Hawk inside on a makeshift stretcher. The wooden pews had been pushed aside, creating space near the pot-bellied stove where blankets lay spread across the floor. Isabel directed them to lay him there, her hands already working at the buttons of his blood-stained shirt. Easy now, she murmured as they settled him down. Her fingers trembled slightly as she peeled back the fabric, revealing the angry wound in his shoulder. Jonas and Anthony hovered nearby, their faces drawn with worry in the dim light. Dr. Matthews arrived minutes later, his medical bag clutched tight. He knelt beside Hawk, examining the wound with practiced hands. "Bullet went clean through. Main concern now is infection and blood loss." Isabel helped the doctor clean and treat the wound, her movements gentle but sure. She held Hawk steady as the doctor worked, noting how his skin felt cool and clammy beneath her touch. The boys sat cross-legged against the nearest pew, watching every movement with wide eyes. Hours crept by like molasses in winter. The doctor came and went, checking on other patients from the night's violence. Isabel remained steadfast at Hawk's side, watching his chest rise and fall, counting each breath. Sometimes his eyes would flutter open, focusing hazily on her face before slipping closed again. When his pulse began to weaken near midday, fear gripped Isabel's heart like an icy fist. She reached for his hand, finding it cold and limp. The terror of losing him, of watching the boys lose another parent, overwhelmed her practiced composure. Isabel sank to her knees beside him. "Please, Lord," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was the first real prayer she'd uttered since burying her husband 2 years ago. "Don't take him too. These boys need their father." Her fingers tightened around Hawk's hand. "And I need them all. Please give us a chance to be a family." Tears fell freely now, dropping onto their clasped hands. "I know I closed my heart after Thomas died, but these 3 have opened it again. Please, Lord, let me keep them." Anthony crept closer, placing his small hand on her shoulder. Jonas followed, pressing against her side. They formed a circle of touch and hope around Hawk's still form, their shared fear and love palpable in the quiet church. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, Hawk's breathing deepened and steadied. Color gradually returned to his face. The doctor returned, checking his pulse and nodding with cautious approval. "The worst has passed, I believe. He's stabilizing." Relief flooded through Isabel, leaving her weak-kneed and grateful. She watched as the boys carefully settled themselves on either side of their father, their small bodies curled protectively around him. Anthony's face relaxed for the first time in days, while Jonas's fingers clutched his father's sleeve. Isabel rose on shaky legs and stepped outside the church. The winter air bit at her tear-stained cheeks, but she welcomed its clarity. Snow had begun falling again, soft flakes drifting in the golden afternoon light. She drew deep breaths, letting the clean mountain air wash away the fear of the past hours. Footsteps crunched in the snow behind her. Reverend Sewell approached, his kind eyes taking in her exhausted posture and relieved expression. "You've become their anchor, Isabel," he said gently. She turned to look through the church window, where Hawk lay sleeping with his sons nestled close. The sight filled her heart with a warmth she'd thought lost forever. Inside, a new prayer formed, not of desperate pleading but of quiet thanksgiving. Morning sunlight streamed through the recorder's office windows, casting warm squares on the worn wooden floor. Isabel stood beside the Redden family as Hawk carefully unrolled the homestead claim documents. His hands were steady now, though he still moved with deliberate care, mindful of his healing shoulder. Anthony and Jonas pressed close to Isabel's sides, their eyes fixed on the papers that would secure their future. The town recorder, Mr. Peterson, adjusted his spectacles and began reading the claim aloud. "This homestead filing, dated April 15, 1873, grants legal title to 160 acres, including the natural spring at Eagle Valley, to Hawk Redden and his heirs. Isabel felt Jonas's small fingers slip into her hand. She squeezed gently, remembering that terrifying night just a week ago when she'd prayed for their survival. Now here they stood, whole and healing, watching their new beginning take shape with each scratched word of the recorder's pen. "Sign here, Mr. Redden," Peterson said, pointing to the bottom of the page. Hawk's signature was firm and clear. The recorder stamped the document with a satisfying thump, making it official. "The spring land is yours now, legally and properly." A small crowd had gathered outside to witness the filing. Reverend Soule smiled broadly from the doorway, while several townspeople offered congratulations. The blacksmith's wife pressed a wrapped loaf of fresh bread into Isabel's hands, and the general store owner presented the boys with candy sticks. Back at the church, where they'd been staying during Hawk's recovery, Isabel helped the boys pack their few belongings. Jonas carefully folded his mother's old quilt, while Anthony organized their father's tools. Isabel added her own contributions: seeds she'd traded for, cooking utensils, and medical supplies from the doctor. They set out at noon, 2 borrowed wagons carrying their supplies. The journey to Eagle Valley took most of the afternoon. As they crested the final ridge, Isabel caught her breath at the sight below. The valley spread out like a green jewel, protected by granite walls that caught the sun. The spring burbled from a rocky outcrop, its clear water feeding a small stream that wound through meadow grass. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Hawk, driving the lead wagon, looked back at her with quiet pride in his eyes. They worked until sunset, Hawk and Anthony raising a temporary shelter, while Isabel and Jonas cleared rocks from a small plot near the spring. The soil there was rich and dark, perfect for the early plantings she hoped to start. Already her mind was planning rows of vegetables, herbs for both cooking and healing. That evening, they sat around the lamp-lit table in their rough shelter, sharing a simple supper of bread, beans, and dried apple slices. The spring's gentle music drifted through the canvas walls, a constant reminder of life and possibility. "Miss Isabel," Jonas spoke up suddenly, his voice still shy but growing stronger each day. "You won't leave us now, will you?" Anthony nodded earnestly. "Please stay. We need you here." Isabel's heart swelled as she looked at their hopeful faces. Before she could respond, Hawk reached across the table and took both her hands in his. The lamplight caught the silver at his temples as he gazed at her with an openness she'd never seen before. "Isabel," he said softly, his voice deep with emotion, "be the mother to my sons, not for survival anymore, for life." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she squeezed his hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll stay." The boys launched themselves into her arms, nearly knocking over the lamp in their excitement. She gathered them close, feeling Hawk's strong arm encircle them all. Later, they sat together on the rough-hewn porch planks Hawk had laid that afternoon. The spring song mingled with the evening breeze, while early stars pricked through the darkening sky. Jonas leaned against Isabel's shoulder, already half asleep. Anthony pointed out constellations he remembered his mother teaching him, while Hawk's hand rested warm and sure against Isabel's back. They had so much ahead, a cabin to build, fields to plant, seasons to weather together. But here, in this moment, with the promise of tomorrow bright before them, they were already home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.